Sarah Mitchell had always been the quiet one at family gatherings. At 32, she worked as a librarian in the small town of Millbrook, where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. Her days were predictable, filled with organizing books, helping students with research, and going home to her small apartment where she lived alone with her cat, Whiskers. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October when everything changed. Sarah was sorting through a box of donated books that had arrived that morning. The donations came from the estate of Margaret Hartley, an elderly woman who had recently passed away. Margaret had been a regular at the library for decades, always sitting in the same corner chair near the poetry section, reading quietly with her wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. As Sarah pulled out the books one by one, she noticed they were mostly classics: Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and various poetry collections. Each book smelled of lavender and old paper, a combination that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. She was about to place a worn copy of Emily Dickinson's poems on the cart when something fell out from between the pages. It was a small cassette tape, the kind people used decades ago to record music or voice messages. A piece of masking tape across it had faded, writing that Sarah could barely make out. "For my angel, October 15th, 1985. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She looked around the empty library. It was nearly closing time, and the last patron had left 20 minutes ago. Rain drummed steadily against the tall windows, creating a rhythmic pattern that seemed to match her suddenly rapid heartbeat. She held the cassette in her palm, feeling its weight. Should she listen to it? Was it even her place to do so? Curiosity won. Sarah remembered the old cassette player they kept in the storage room for archived materials. She locked the library doors, dimmed most of the lights, and made her way to the back room. The cassette player was dusty but still functional. With trembling fingers, she inserted the tape and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then a man's voice emerged, warm and gentle, with a slight tremor that suggested age or emotion. "My dearest Margaret," the voice began, "if you're listening to this, then I've finally found the courage to give it to you. Or perhaps I haven't, and you've found it after I'm gone. Either way, there are things I need to say, things I should have said 40 years ago." Sarah sat down heavily in the desk chair, her full attention on the voice filling the small room. The man continued, "I've loved you since the day you walked into my bookshop wearing that yellow sundress. You were 19, I was 21, and you were looking for a book of Shakespeare's sonnets for your literature class. Do you remember? You said you needed to understand what real love poetry looked like." The voice paused, and Sarah could hear a shaky breath. "I showed you to the poetry section, and we talked for hours. You missed your class that day. We talked about books, about dreams, about the places we wanted to see. You told me you wanted to visit Paris and see the Eiffel Tower at sunset. I said I wanted to see it with you." Sarah found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed. The man's voice grew softer, but then Richard came along. Richard with his stable job at the bank, his nice car, his parents' approval. I was just a struggling bookshop owner, barely making ends meet. When you told me you were engaged to him, I smiled and congratulated you. I even came to your wedding. Do you remember? I gave you that first edition of Wuthering Heights as a wedding gift. You cried when you opened it." The rain outside intensified and thunder rolled in the distance. Sarah barely noticed. She was transported to another time, another story of love and loss unfolding through the crackling tape. "I watched you build a life with him," the voice continued. "You had 2 beautiful children. I met someone too, Helen. She was kind and patient, and she loved me in her quiet way. We had a good life together. But Margaret, not a day passed when I didn't think of you. When Helen passed 5 years ago, I thought about reaching out. But I heard Richard was sick, and it didn't seem right." There was a longer pause, and Sarah could hear papers rustling in the background of the recording. I'm 78 now, Margaret. The doctors say my heart is failing. Ironic, since it's been broken for decades. I walk past the library sometimes and see you in there, still as beautiful as ever with your silver hair and those same bright eyes. You still wear yellow sometimes. Did you know that? Last Tuesday, you wore a yellow scarf, and for a moment, I was 21 again. Sarah felt tears rolling down her cheeks. She thought of all the times she'd seen Margaret in the library, always alone, always with a gentle smile but a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I'm leaving you my bookshop in my will," the man said. "It's been closed for years now, but I could never bear to sell it. Too many memories. The key is hidden where we carved our initials that summer afternoon. You remember the old oak tree in Riverside Park? Inside the shop, in the poetry section where we first met, behind the Shakespeare volumes, there's something I've kept all these years, something that belongs to you." The voice grew very quiet now. "I don't expect anything, Margaret. I just needed you to know that you were loved, truly and completely, by someone who never had the courage to fight for you. Every book I read, every sunset I saw, every moment of beauty in this world, I experienced it all thinking of you. You made my entire life more beautiful just by existing in it." There was a click, and the recording ended. Sarah sat in the darkness, overwhelmed by what she'd just heard. She rewound the tape and carefully removed it from the player. This message had been waiting almost 40 years to be heard, but Margaret had died without ever knowing about it. Or had she? The tape had been in her book, after all. Sarah's mind raced. The bookshop the man mentioned, she knew it. The old Hartley Books on Main Street had been boarded up for years. Everyone assumed it had been owned by some distant relative of Margaret's family. But now Sarah wondered, had Margaret known? Had she ever gone there? She looked at the cassette tape again, then at her phone. It was past 9 o'clock, and the rain had turned into a storm. But Sarah knew she wouldn't be able to sleep without knowing more. She grabbed her raincoat and umbrella, tucked the cassette safely in her pocket, and headed out into the storm. The streets of Millbrook were deserted, rain flowing like small rivers along the gutters. Sarah's umbrella turned inside out twice before she gave up on it, letting the rain soak through her coat. She didn't care. She was driven by something stronger than discomfort, the need to uncover the rest of this story. Hartley Books stood on a corner lot, its windows covered with plywood, a for sale sign hanging crooked in the window. Sarah walked around to Riverside Park, using her phone's flashlight to find the old oak tree. It was massive, its trunk scarred with decades of carved initials. She ran her fingers along the rough bark until she found them. M+T inside a heart, the carving weathered but still visible. At the base of the tree, partially hidden by fallen leaves, was a small metal box. Sarah's heart pounded as she opened it. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a key. The bookshop's door opened with a groan. Sarah stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Dust motes danced in the light, and the smell of old books and mustiness filled her nostrils. She could almost imagine how it must have looked decades ago. Shelves lined with books, the warmth of reading lamps, the quiet murmur of book lovers browsing. She found the poetry section easily, as if drawn to it. Behind a row of Shakespeare volumes, just as the man had said, was a wooden box. Sarah opened it with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to Margaret, but never sent. There were photos, too. A young couple laughing at what looked like a bookshop opening, the same couple sitting by a fountain, and one of just Margaret, radiant in a yellow sundress, her hair catching the sunlight. But what made Sarah gasp was the small velvet box at the bottom. She opened it to find an engagement ring, simple but elegant, with a small diamond that caught her flashlight beam and scattered it into tiny rainbows. A note was wrapped around the ring box. "I bought this the day before you told me about Richard. I've kept it all these years, hoping someday I'd find the courage. Thomas. Sarah sank to the floor, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had lasted a lifetime but had never been spoken. She thought about Margaret, spending her final years in the library, and wondered if she had known about Thomas's feelings. Had she loved him too? Had she spent her life with Richard while her heart belonged to someone else? As Sarah sat there in the dusty bookshop, she made a decision. This story couldn't end with her. There had to be more to uncover, more to understand. Margaret had children. They deserved to know about this part of their mother's life, and somewhere out there, Thomas might have family too. She carefully gathered all the letters, photos, and the ring, placing them in a canvas bag she found behind the counter. As she prepared to leave, her flashlight beam caught something else, a journal on the desk in what must have been the shop's office. She opened it to the last entry, dated just a month ago. Margaret is gone. I saw the obituary in yesterday's paper. 91 years old. She outlived Richard by 15 years. I wonder if she was happy. I hope she was happy. Tomorrow I'll go to the cemetery, leave flowers, yellow roses like the dress she wore. Maybe I'll finally tell her everything. Maybe in death, I'll find the courage I lacked in life. Thomas. Sarah's tears fell freely now. Thomas was still alive. Somewhere in Millbrook, an elderly man was grieving alone for a love he'd never confessed. She had to find him. This story needed a different ending than two people loving each other in silence until death. She locked the bookshop carefully and put the key back in its hiding place. Tomorrow, she would begin her search for Thomas. Tonight, she would go through the letters and photos, piecing together a love story that had spanned decades. As she walked home through the rain, Sarah felt as if she was carrying something precious and fragile. Not just the physical items in her bag, but the weight of untold love, of chances not taken, of words left unspoken. The hidden message had been found, but its impact was just beginning to unfold. Sarah didn't know it yet, but this discovery would change not only her understanding of love and courage, but would ripple out to touch many lives in ways she couldn't imagine. The story of Margaret and Thomas was far from over. It was just beginning to be told. Sarah barely slept that night. She spread the contents of the wooden box across her living room floor, creating a timeline of a love story that had remained hidden for decades. The letters were organized by year, starting from 1946 and continuing until just last year. Each one was addressed to Margaret but never sent, creating a one-sided conversation that spanned a lifetime. The earliest letter was written in careful cursive, the ink faded but still legible. Thomas wrote about the day after Margaret's wedding, how he had closed the bookshop early and walked for hours in the rain. He wrote about seeing her with Richard at the grocery store, how she had smiled at him but her eyes had seemed to ask a question he couldn't answer. Letter after letter revealed a man who had loved deeply but never spoken, who had found beauty in the smallest moments simply because Margaret existed in the same world. As dawn broke through her apartment windows, Sarah found herself looking at a photo dated 1962. It showed Margaret and Thomas at what appeared to be a town festival. They stood side by side, but not touching, both smiling at the camera. Someone else must have taken it, perhaps Thomas's wife Helen or Margaret's husband Richard. How strange it must have been, Sarah thought, to maintain friendships when such feelings existed beneath the surface. She picked up her phone and called in sick to work. Her supervisor, Janet, sounded concerned. Sarah never missed work. "I'm fine," Sarah assured her. "There's just something important I need to do today." After hanging up, she realized it was true. This was important. More important than organizing books or helping with research. This was about honoring a love story that deserved to be known. Sarah's first stop was the town records office. If Thomas had written in his journal just a month ago, he might still be alive. The clerk, a young woman named Amy, was helpful once Sarah explained she was trying to return some valuable items to their owner. After some searching, they found him. Thomas Brennan, age 93, residing at Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility on the outskirts of town. Sunset Manor was a pleasant place with well-maintained gardens and cheerful staff. Sarah clutched the canvas bag containing the letters and photos, her nervousness growing with each step. At the reception desk, she asked for Thomas Brennan. "Oh, Mr. Brennan," the receptionist smiled. "He's probably in the library. He spends most of his time there, down the hall, third door on the right." Of course he would be in the library, Sarah thought. She found him exactly where the receptionist had said, a frail man with wispy white hair sitting by the window with a book of poetry in his lap. He looked up as she approached, his eyes still bright despite his age. "Mr. Brennan," Sarah said softly. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I work at the Millbrook Public Library." His face changed at the mention of the library, a mixture of pain and something else crossing his features. "The library," he repeated. "Yes, I know it well." Sarah sat down across from him, unsure how to begin. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out the cassette tape. Thomas's eyes widened and his hands trembled as he reached for it. "Where did you find this?" he whispered. "It was in a book of Emily Dickinson's poetry, donated from Margaret Hartley's estate," Sarah explained. "I listened to it. I'm sorry if that was wrong, but I felt like it was meant to be heard." Thomas held the tape like it was made of spun glass. 40 years, he said quietly. "I made this 40 years ago, carried it in my pocket for months, but could never give it to her. How did it end up in her book?" "I was hoping you could tell me," Sarah said. "I found your bookshop, Mr. Brennan. I found the letters, the photos, everything you left for her." The old man's eyes filled with tears. "You found them? After all this time?" He was quiet for a long moment. "May I see them?" Sarah handed him the bag, watching as he pulled out the letters with shaking hands. He touched each one gently, as if touching memories themselves. When he came to the photos, a small smile played at his lips. "This one," he said, holding up the photo of Margaret in the yellow sundress, "was taken the day before she told me about Richard. We had spent the afternoon at the summer fair. I won her a stuffed bear at the ring toss game. She laughed so much that day. I was planning to propose that evening. I had it all planned out. Dinner at Romano's, a walk by the river, the ring in my pocket." "What happened?" Sarah asked gently. Thomas sighed deeply. "She came to the bookshop that morning, earlier than usual. She was nervous, kept fidgeting with her hands. Then she told me Richard had proposed the night before and she had said yes. Her parents were thrilled. Richard came from a good family, had a steady job at the bank. She said she hoped we could still be friends." He looked out the window, lost in memories. "I should have fought for her, should have told her how I felt, but I was young and foolish, thought that loving her meant wanting her to be happy, even if it wasn't with me. So I smiled and said, of course, we could still be friends. I think I knew even then it was the biggest mistake of my life." "The cassette," Sarah prompted. "How do you think it ended up with her?" Thomas frowned, thinking. "There was one day, it must have been 1986 or 87. Margaret came into the bookshop. Richard was traveling for business, and she seemed sad. We talked for hours, like we used to when we were young. When she was leaving, I almost gave it to her. I had it in my hand, but then I saw her wedding ring catching the light, and I put it back in my pocket." He paused, remembering. "But she hugged me that day. She never usually did that. We were always so careful to maintain proper distance. When she hugged me, she whispered, 'Thank you for always being there, Thomas. Maybe Maybe the tape fell into her bag. Or maybe... His eyes widened. Helen. My wife, Helen. Your wife? Sarah asked, surprised. Thomas nodded slowly. Helen was a good woman, patient and kind. She knew, I think. Not the details, but she knew my heart belonged to someone else. We were married for 35 years, and she never once complained, never asked why I sometimes stared too long at nothing, lost in thoughts of someone else. A few months before she died, she told me something strange. She said, Thomas, life is too short for unspoken words. Don't let yours remain unspoken. He picked up one of the later letters, dated just after Helen's death. I thought she meant I should tell Margaret after she was gone. But what if Helen found the tape? What if she made sure Margaret got it? Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. That would mean Margaret knew. She had the tape all these years. But she never said anything, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Even after Richard died, she never reached out. Sarah pulled out the journal she had found in the bookshop. Mr. Brennan, there's something else. I found this in your shop. But before I show it to you, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about this all night. What if Margaret felt the same way? What if she also thought it was too late, that too much time had passed? Thomas looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. Sarah continued, You both spent your lives protecting other people's feelings, honoring your commitments. But what if you were both waiting for a sign from the other? She opened the journal to a page she had marked. This entry is from 5 years ago, right after your wife passed. You wrote about seeing Margaret at Helen's funeral. You said she held your hand and whispered something you couldn't hear over the wind. Thomas's breath caught. I remember. I always wondered what she said. Sarah had an idea. Mr. Brennan, Margaret's children, do you know them? David and Emma, Thomas said immediately. David looks just like his father, but Emma has Margaret's eyes. They're both in their 60s now. David lives in California, but Emma still lives here in Millbrook. We should talk to Emma, Sarah said decisively. She might know something about her mother's feelings, and she deserves to know about you, about this love her mother inspired. Thomas looked uncertain. I don't know if that's appropriate. What if it upsets her? Learning about this after her mother is gone. Sarah reached across and gently touched his hand. Mr. Brennan, you've kept this secret for 70 years. Don't you think it's time for the truth to be told? Not just for you, but for Margaret's memory too. Her children should know that their mother was deeply loved, that she inspired such devotion. The old man was quiet for a long time, then slowly nodded. You're right. I'm 93 years old, Sarah. If not now, when? Sarah helped Thomas gather the letters and photos. As they prepared to leave, she noticed he was holding the velvet ring box. Are you going to bring that? She asked. Thomas looked at the ring, its small diamond still catching the light after all these years. I bought this with 3 months of savings, he said. I looked at hundreds of rings. But this one reminded me of her. Simple, elegant, perfect. Yes, I'll bring it. It's part of the story. They drove to Emma's house in Sarah's car, Thomas giving directions to a neat colonial on the tree-lined Maple Street. Sarah could feel his nervousness as they parked. It's going to be okay, she assured him, though her own heart was racing. Emma Hartley Morrison answered the door, and Sarah caught her breath. Thomas was right. She had Margaret's eyes, the same bright, intelligent gaze. Yes, she said politely, looking between them. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah began. I'm Sarah Mitchell from the library. This is Thomas Brennan. We have some things that belong to your mother that we'd like to share with you. May we come in? Emma's expression changed at Thomas's name. Thomas Brennan, she repeated slowly. The bookshop owner. Mother mentioned you sometimes. She stepped aside. Please, come in. They sat in Emma's living room, surrounded by family photos. Sarah noticed several of Margaret in her later years, still beautiful with silver hair and those distinctive eyes. Emma served tea, her movements careful and precise, so like her mother's. Now, Emma said, settling into her chair, what's this about? Sarah let Thomas tell the story. His voice was steady as he spoke about meeting Margaret, about the decades of silent love, about the tape and the letters. Emma listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Finally, Emma stood and walked to a bookshelf. She pulled out a leather-bound journal and returned to her seat. "Mr. Brennan," she said softly, "I think it's time you heard my mother's side of the story." She opened the journal, her fingers finding a marked page. "This is from 1985, October 16th, the day after the date on your tape." She began to read in a clear voice. "The strangest thing happened today. I found a cassette tape in my bag when I got home from the library. I don't know how it got there. The handwriting on it looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. I listened to it after Richard went to bed. It was Thomas. My dear, sweet Thomas, saying all the things I've dreamed of hearing for 40 years. I sat in the dark kitchen and cried until I couldn't cry anymore. How did he know? How did he know that I've loved him every day since I was 19? That I married Richard because I was young and scared and thought I was doing what was expected? That every book I read, I wondered what Thomas would think of it, that I wore yellow whenever I felt sad because it reminded me of the day we met." Emma paused, looking at Thomas, whose tears were flowing freely now. She continued reading. "I can't act on this. Richard is a good man who loves me. We have children, a life together, but oh, to know that Thomas felt the same way all these years. It's both the most wonderful and the most tragic thing. I'll keep this tape forever. Sometimes when the loneliness is too much, I'll listen to his voice and pretend we made different choices." Emma closed the journal and looked at Thomas. "She wrote about you often, Mr. Brennan, especially after my father died. She wanted to reach out, but she thought you must have moved on. She was 76 years old and convinced that too much time had passed." "She loved me?" Thomas whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Emma nodded, tears in her own eyes now. "She did. Very much. On her deathbed, she made me promise something that I didn't understand until now. She said, 'Emma, if you ever meet Thomas Brennan, tell him I heard his message. Tell him he was right. Seeing the Eiffel Tower alone wasn't the same. Tell him the Shakespeare sonnets finally made sense.'" The room was heavy with emotion. Sarah watched as understanding dawned on Thomas's face. All those years of silent longing, and Margaret had felt the same way. Two lives lived in parallel, loving each other from a distance, both too afraid or too honorable to speak the truth. Thomas pulled out the velvet ring box with trembling hands. "I bought this for her in 1945, he said to Emma. "I've carried it with me ever since. I know it's too late for your mother and me, but would you want it? As something that was meant for her?" Emma took the box gently, opening it to see the simple, elegant ring. "It's beautiful," she whispered. She would have loved it. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mr. Brennan, would you like to see more of her journals? She wrote about you throughout her life. I think you deserve to know how much you meant to her." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Emma brought out several more journals, and together they read Margaret's words. Page after page revealed a woman who had lived a full life, but had never stopped loving her first love. She wrote about seeing Thomas with Helen, how she had been genuinely happy that he had found someone, even as her heart broke a little. She wrote about their careful friendship, the boundaries they maintained, the words they never said. One entry particularly struck Sarah. Margaret had written, "Thomas came to Richard's funeral today. He stood at the back, but I saw him. Afterwards, he hugged me and said, I'm here if you need anything. I wanted to tell him I'd always needed him, but the words wouldn't come. We're in our 70s now. Is it ridiculous to still feel like that 19-year-old girl when I see him? As the afternoon wore on, a fuller picture emerged. Two people who had loved each other deeply but had chosen duty and honor over passion. Both had built good lives with other people, had children and grandchildren, but had never forgotten their first love. It was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. She kept everything, Emma said, showing them a box from her mother's closet. Inside were ticket stubs from the summer fair in 1945, pressed flowers, a ribbon from the stuffed bear Thomas had won for her. I always wondered why she kept these random things. At the bottom of the box was an envelope marked, "For Thomas, to be opened only if." The "if" was never specified. Emma handed it to Thomas. With shaking hands, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Margaret's handwriting. "My dearest Thomas, if you're reading this, then perhaps courage has finally found one of us, or perhaps we've run out of time. Either way, I want you to know. I loved you. I loved you the day we met. I loved you the day I married Richard. I loved you the day you married Helen. And I love you now as I write this. We made choices that seemed right at the time, and I don't regret the life I built. My children are my joy. But you were my first love, my truest love, and the great what-if of my life. I hope you found happiness. I hope Helen loved you the way you deserve to be loved, and I hope someday, in another life perhaps, we get our chance. Until then, know that you were loved completely by your Margaret." The letter was dated just a year ago, shortly before Margaret's health had declined. Thomas held it to his chest, his tears falling freely. "She called herself my Margaret," he whispered. "She was always my Margaret." Emma wiped her own tears. "Mr. Brennan, I'm glad you came today. I'm glad I know this story now. My mother was a wonderful woman. But there was always a sadness about her that I couldn't understand. Now I do." As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows, Sarah helped Thomas prepare to leave. Emma walked them to the door, carrying the box of mementos. "Mr. Brennan," Emma said, "would you like to keep some of these things? They were as much yours as hers." Thomas selected just a few items: the photo of Margaret in the yellow dress, one of her pressed flowers, and the letter she had written to him. "Thank you," he said to Emma. "Thank you for sharing her with me." Emma hugged him gently. "You made my mother's life richer just by being in it, even from a distance. That's a rare kind of love, Mr. Brennan." As Sarah drove Thomas back to Sunset Manor, he was quiet, processing everything they had learned. Finally, he spoke. 70 years, Sarah. We loved each other for 70 years and never said the words aloud to each other. What a waste." "Was it, though?" Sarah asked gently. "You both lived full lives. You both honored your commitments, and your love for each other never diminished. That's not a waste, Mr. Brennan. That's extraordinary." Thomas smiled sadly. "Perhaps you're right. But oh, what I wouldn't give for just one day with her, knowing what I know now." Back at Sunset Manor, Sarah helped Thomas to his room. He carefully arranged Margaret's photo and the pressed flower on his bedside table. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. "Thank you for bringing me her words. I'll be able to rest easier knowing she knew, knowing she felt the same way." Sarah hugged the old man goodbye, promising to visit again soon. As she drove home, she thought about the love story she had uncovered. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she had hoped for. No dramatic reunion, no final declaration of love face to face. Instead, it was something more complex and perhaps more real. Two people who had loved deeply but had chosen responsibility over passion, who had found a way to honor their love while living separate lives. The hidden message had finally been delivered. decades too late for Margaret and Thomas to build a life together, but perhaps just in time for Thomas to find peace. And for Sarah, who had thought her life in the small-town library was uneventful, this discovery had changed something fundamental. She had witnessed a love that had endured for 70 years without a single kiss, without promises or shared dreams, sustained only by stolen glances and careful friendship. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah made a decision. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in months. Michael, her college boyfriend who had moved away for work but had recently returned to Millbrook. They had ended things because the timing wasn't right, because they were focused on their careers, because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. "Hello?" Michael's voice was surprised but warm. "Hi," Sarah said, her heart racing. "I know this is unexpected, but I've been thinking. Could we meet for coffee? There's something I need to tell you." Because if Margaret and Thomas had taught her anything, it was that love was too precious to leave unspoken, that chances were too rare to let slip away. The hidden message had been delivered, and its ripples were already changing lives. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's discovery of the hidden message. The autumn days grew shorter, and the library filled with students preparing for end-of-term exams. But Sarah found her mind constantly wandering to Thomas and Margaret's story. She had kept her promise to visit Thomas at Sunset Manor, spending Thursday afternoons reading poetry with him, Emily Dickinson, Shakespeare, and all the poets Margaret had loved. On this particular Thursday, Sarah arrived to find Thomas more animated than she'd ever seen him. "Sarah," he called out as she entered the library at Sunset Manor, "I have something to show you." He handed her a letter written in shaky but determined handwriting. "I wrote to David, Margaret's son in California. I told him everything. And look what came in the mail today." Sarah read the response, her eyes widening. David had written back, thanking Thomas for sharing the story. But more importantly, he had included something else. Pages from a letter Margaret had written to David but never sent, found among her papers after she died. The letter read, "My dear David, there are things about my life I've never told you and Emma. I loved your father, and we built a good life together. But before him, there was someone else. Thomas Brennan owned the bookshop on Main Street. I loved him from the moment I met him, but I was young and frightened of what people would think. A shopkeeper's wife seemed like such a small life compared to what your grandparents wanted for me. I chose security over passion, and while I never regretted having you and Emma, I regretted not being brave enough to follow my heart. If you're reading this after I'm gone, please know that it's possible to love two people in different ways. Your father gave me stability and children and a place in the community. But Thomas gave me poetry and dreams and the feeling that magic existed in the world. I hope you understand." Thomas's eyes glistened as Sarah finished reading. "She wanted them to know," he said softly. "She wanted them to understand." "There's more," Sarah said, noticing additional pages. David had written that he was flying to Millbrook next week. He wanted to meet Thomas, to hear more about his mother's early years. To understand this part of her life, she had kept hidden. As they sat together, Thomas shared more memories with Sarah. He told her about the poetry readings they used to attend at the library, always sitting on opposite sides of the room, but sharing glances when a particularly moving verse was read. He spoke about the book recommendations they traded, how Margaret would leave notes in the margins of books she returned to his shop. Little comments meant just for him. "There was this one time," Thomas said, smiling at the memory. "Must have been in the 60s. Margaret came into the shop with Emma, who was about 5 then. Emma picked up a book of fairy tales and asked her mother to read it to her. Margaret sat in the children's section, reading about princesses and true love's kiss, and when she looked up at me, there were tears in her eyes. Later, she bought the book and whispered, 'Some fairy tales don't have happy endings, do they?' I wanted so badly to tell her that ours still could, but her husband was waiting in the car outside. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Thomas shared these memories. Each one was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. "But you know," Thomas continued, "I've been thinking a lot these past weeks. Maybe our story did have a happy ending, just not the one we expected. We loved each other for 70 years without causing pain to others, without breaking the promises we made. There's something noble in that, don't you think?" Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Michael. "Coffee was wonderful yesterday. Dinner tonight? I have something to tell you too." Sarah smiled, thinking of how her coffee with Michael had gone. She had told him about Thomas and Margaret, about lives lived with unspoken love, about the courage it takes to say what's in your heart. Michael had listened intently, then took her hand and said, "I never stopped thinking about us, Sarah. I thought letting you go was the mature thing to do, but maybe maturity means fighting for what matters." "Good news?" Thomas asked, noticing her smile. "Yes," Sarah said, putting her phone away. "Your story inspired me to take a chance, Mr. Brennan, to not let fear decide my future." Thomas reached over and patted her hand. "Good, that's good. Don't be like Margaret and me, Sarah. We had our reasons, our obligations, but you have choices we didn't have. Use them." Over the next few days, Sarah found herself busy with an unexpected project. Emma, Margaret's daughter, had called her with an idea. She wanted to create something lasting from her mother and Thomas's story. A scholarship fund at the library for young writers, particularly those writing about love and literature. She asked if Sarah would help organize it. "My mother would have loved that," Emma had said, "supporting young people brave enough to put their feelings into words, something she could never quite do." Sarah threw herself into the project. She reached out to the town council, to local businesses, to everyone who had known Margaret through her years at the library. The response was overwhelming. It seemed Margaret had touched many lives with her quiet presence and love of books. The night before David was due to arrive from California, Sarah visited Thomas again. He was nervous, straightening his clothes repeatedly, asking if he looked presentable. "You look fine, Mr. Brennan," Sarah assured him. "David wants to meet you. He's not coming to judge you. He's coming to understand his mother better." "What if he's angry?" Thomas worried. "What if he thinks I somehow dishonored his mother's memory by loving her?" Sarah shook her head. "He read her letter. He knows she loved you too. I think he's coming because he wants to thank you for loving her so faithfully, even from afar." The next morning, Sarah accompanied Thomas to the meeting with David at Emma's house. David was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair, but when he smiled, Sarah could see Margaret in his expression. He shook Thomas's hand warmly, then surprised everyone by pulling the elderly man into a gentle hug. "Mr. Brennan," David said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to thank you. My mother was a wonderful woman, but there was always a wistfulness about her that I couldn't understand. Now I know she was missing you." They spent hours talking. David and Emma asked questions about their mother's youth, about the bookshop, about the poetry she loved. Thomas told them stories they'd never heard, how Margaret could recite entire Shakespeare sonnets from memory, how she always hummed when she was happy, how she had a laugh that could light up a room. "She did that until the end," Emma said. "The humming, whenever she was reading something she particularly enjoyed." David had brought photo albums from California, including pictures from Margaret's youth that Thomas had never seen. There she was at high school graduation, at college, on her wedding day. Thomas studied each photo with reverence, seeing the progression of the girl he'd fallen in love with into the woman she'd become. "This one," David said, pointing to a photo from the 1970s, "was at my college graduation. See how she's looking off to the side? You were there that day, weren't you? Thomas nodded slowly. I was. My nephew was graduating too. I saw her across the auditorium. We waved, but Richard was there, so we didn't speak. She kept the program from that day, Emma said suddenly. I found it in her things. There was a circle drawn around your nephew's name. I didn't understand why at the time. As the day wore on, Sarah watched a new understanding develop between Thomas and Margaret's children. They weren't just learning about their mother's first love. They were discovering a part of her they'd never known. A woman who had lived with profound grace, despite carrying an unspoken love for decades. I have something for you both, Thomas said finally. He pulled out 2 small wrapped packages. Inside were first edition poetry books from his shop, each one carefully selected. For Emma, Emily Dickinson. For David, Walt Whitman. Your mother and I used to discuss which poems reminded us of each of you when you were young. These were the ones she chose. Both siblings were moved to tears. Inside each book, in Thomas's careful handwriting, was an inscription. For Emma David, your mother saw poetry in everything, but especially in you, with love from someone who loved her from afar, Thomas. As the meeting drew to a close, David made an announcement. Mr. Brennan, Emma and I have been discussing this. We'd like you to have some of Mom's ashes. We know that might sound strange, but you loved her for 70 years. You should be able to say goodbye properly. Thomas was overwhelmed, unable to speak for several moments. Finally, he managed, I don't know what to say. That's the kindest thing anyone has ever offered me. They arranged for a small ceremony at Riverside Park, near the oak tree where Thomas and Margaret had carved their initials so many years ago. It was a crisp November morning when they gathered, Thomas, Sarah, Emma, David, and a few close friends who had known the story. Thomas had prepared words, written on a piece of paper that trembled in his hands. My dearest Margaret, he read, his voice carrying across the quiet park. I'm finally saying the words I should have said 70 years ago. I love you. I've loved you every day since you walked into my shop looking for Shakespeare. I loved you through all the years of careful distance, through all the almosts and maybes. You made my entire life more beautiful just by being in the world. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to fight for us when we were young, but I'm grateful for every moment I got to see you, every smile we shared, every book we discussed. Rest now, my darling. I'll see you again someday, and maybe then we'll finally get to watch that Eiffel Tower sunset together. As Thomas scattered some of Margaret's ashes around the old oak tree, a gentle breeze carried them toward the river. Emma and David stood on either side of him, supporting the old man as he said his final goodbye to the love of his life. After the ceremony, they all went to the bookshop. Thomas had decided to reopen it as a reading room for the library, a place where young lovers could meet over poetry and stories. With Sarah's help and the support of Margaret's children, they had cleaned and restored the space. The poetry section, where Thomas and Margaret had first met, was now a cozy reading nook with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. The Margaret Hartley Memorial Reading Room. Thomas read from the new plaque they had installed. For all who believe in the power of words and the endurance of love. The grand opening was scheduled for the following week, but Thomas wanted to see it one more time before the crowds came. He walked slowly through the space, running his hands along the shelves, pausing in the spot where Margaret had stood all those years ago. She would have loved this, he said softly. Sarah watched from the doorway as the old man moved through his memories. In just a few weeks, she had seen him transform from a lonely elderly man carrying a lifetime of regret to someone who had found peace with his past. The hidden message had done more than reveal a secret love. It had brought healing and understanding to everyone it touched. That evening, Sarah met Michael for dinner. He was already there when she arrived, and her heart skipped when she saw he had chosen the same restaurant where they'd had their first date years ago. "I have something for you," Michael said after they'd ordered. He pulled out a small wrapped package. Inside was a book of poetry, Pablo Neruda's love sonnets. "I remembered you loved poetry," he said shyly. "And after hearing about Thomas and Margaret, I thought maybe we should have our own book to share." Sarah opened it to find he had written on the first page. "For Sarah, let's not wait 70 years to say what's in our hearts. Love, Michael." "I love you too," Sarah said, the words coming easily now. "I think I always have. I just needed Thomas and Margaret to teach me that love isn't something to postpone or hide. It's something to celebrate, even when it's complicated or the timing seems wrong." As they talked through dinner, making plans and sharing dreams they'd been too cautious to voice before, Sarah thought about the ripple effects of one hidden message. Thomas had found peace and a new purpose in sharing Margaret's memory. Emma and David had discovered a deeper understanding of their mother. The town would have a new space for young people to discover the magic of literature and love, and Sarah herself had found the courage to embrace her own love story. A week later, the Margaret Hartley Memorial Reading Room officially opened. The small space was packed with townspeople who remembered Margaret from the library, young couples drawn by the romantic story, and students from the local college eager to use the new reading space. Thomas, dressed in his best suit, cut the ribbon with steady hands. "Margaret believed in the power of words," he said to the gathered crowd. "She believed that books could transport us, teach us, help us understand ourselves and each other. This room is for everyone who believes the same. May you find magic in these shelves, as Margaret and I did so many years ago." As people explored the space, Sarah noticed a young couple in the poetry section, shyly discussing their favorite verses. She smiled, wondering if she was witnessing the beginning of another love story. That was the thing about love, she realized. It was always beginning somewhere, always finding new ways to express itself. Thomas stayed until the last visitor left, sitting in his favorite chair by the window. Sarah sat with him as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Thank you, Sarah," Thomas said quietly. "Thank you for finding that tape, for believing the story was worth telling, for bringing me Margaret's words. You've given an old man more peace than you can imagine." "You gave me something too, Mr. Brennan," Sarah replied. "You taught me that love isn't just about the chances we take. It's about how we honor our feelings, whether spoken or silent. You and Margaret loved each other with such faithfulness, such constancy. That's its own kind of courage." Thomas smiled, his eyes reflecting the sunset. "You know, I used to think our story was a tragedy. Two people who loved each other but never got to be together. But now I see it differently. We did have a life together, just not the conventional kind. Every book she read that I recommended, every poem we both loved, every smile across a crowded room, that was our life together. Different from what I dreamed, but real nonetheless." As winter settled over Millbrook, the reading room became a beloved fixture in the community. Students studied there, book clubs met among the shelves, and yes, young couples discovered each other over shared stories. Thomas visited several times a week, always sitting in the same chair, always with a book of poetry in his lap. On a snowy afternoon in December, Sarah found Thomas in his usual spot, but something was different. He was holding the photo of Margaret in the yellow dress, and his expression was more peaceful than she'd ever seen it. "Mr. Brennan?" she said softly. He looked up with a gentle smile. "I had the most wonderful dream last night, Sarah. Margaret and I were in Paris, watching the sunset from the Eiffel Tower. She was wearing that yellow dress, and she was young and beautiful and laughing. And do you know what she said to me?" Sarah shook her head, tears already forming in her eyes. "She said, 'I've been waiting for you, Thomas. I've been waiting right here.' And I knew, Sarah. I knew I'd be seeing her soon. Thomas Brennan passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. At his funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives he'd touched. Through his bookshop, through his story, through the quiet dignity with which he'd lived. Emma and David were there, treating his passing with the same grief they would have shown for a beloved uncle. Michael held Sarah's hand as she delivered the eulogy, speaking about hidden messages and patient love, and the courage it takes to hold feelings sacred even when they can't be expressed. They buried Thomas with Margaret's photo, her pressed flower, and her final letter to him. Emma and David insisted he be laid to rest near their mother. Two lovers finally close after a lifetime apart. After the funeral, Sarah found an envelope in her library mailbox, addressed in Thomas's shaky handwriting. Inside was a letter dated the day before he died. Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then I've gone to find my Margaret. I wanted to thank you one more time for the gift you gave me. Not just the tape or the letters, but the understanding that love doesn't always look like what we expect. You helped me see that Margaret and I did have a beautiful love story, just one written in glances and shared silences and parallel lives. Please tell anyone who asks that loving someone for 70 years, even from afar, was the greatest privilege of my life, and tell them not to be like us. Tell them to speak their love out loud, to take chances, to be brave. But if they can't, if circumstances prevent it, tell them that silent love, patient love, enduring love has its own dignity and beauty. The reading room is my gift to future generations. May they find love among those shelves as Margaret and I did, and may they have the courage we lacked to pursue it. Thank you for being the messenger who finally delivered words that waited 40 years to be heard. You changed an old man's final days from regret to gratitude. That's a rare gift, Sarah. Use your kindness and courage to keep changing lives. With love and eternal gratitude, Thomas P.S. I've left something for you in the poetry section of the reading room, behind the Shakespeare sonnets. Consider it a thank you from Margaret and me. Sarah drove immediately to the reading room, her hands shaking as she searched behind the Shakespeare volumes. There she found a small wrapped package with her name on it. Inside was a first edition of Emily Dickinson's poems, the same one that had held the hidden cassette tape. But now it contained something else. A check made out to her for enough money to pursue the graduate degree in library science she'd always dreamed of but could never afford. A note was tucked inside. Margaret always said librarians were the keepers of love stories. Help others find theirs. T&M. Sarah clutched the book to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Even in death, Thomas and Margaret were changing lives, their love story rippling outward in ways they never could have imagined. Years later, when Sarah had become head librarian and married Michael in a small ceremony in the Margaret Hartley Memorial Reading Room, she would tell the story of the hidden message to anyone who would listen. How a love that lasted 70 years without a single kiss had taught an entire town about the endurance of true feeling. How two people who never spoke their love aloud had ultimately spoken it to the world through their story. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the reading room was quiet, Sarah swore she could feel them there, Thomas and Margaret together at last, watching over the lovers who found each other among the poetry shelves, making sure no one else waited 70 years to speak their heart. The hidden message had been delivered, its purpose fulfilled in ways no one could have expected. Love, it seemed, always found a way to be heard, even if it took decades and the help of a curious librarian to give it voice. And in a small town in New England, in a cozy reading room filled with poetry and possibility, new love stories began every day, inspired by two people who had loved faithfully, completely, and forever. Thomas and Margaret's story had ended, but its echo would continue for generations, a reminder that love, whether spoken or silent, whether fulfilled or yearning, was always worth honoring, always worth remembering, and always, always worth the courage to finally speak its truth.